LeQuant were in London, and there's no way that they can escape us but to give us a story of the Mangrove Nine. We want not only to know that they won, we know they won, but we want to know how they won, because we have to learn to win. We need a few victories our side.
I'm really pleased that people have come out tonight to support the struggle of the people in Haiti. And when I was asked to speak at this meeting, I was a bit apprehensive because I don't know what I want to say really. But I was reading Chinua Achebe this week, Anthems of the Savannah. And in it he talks about the importance of telling the story. He talks in that book about the gifts that people get. And some people get the gift to stir things up and say, listen, we've got some problems here, we've got to do something about it. And then some people get the gift to get up and do the fight. And at the end of the fight, some people have to tell the story. And the story is not owned by you, the story owns you. That's what he said. And so this story that owns us, that owns me and that owns you, is really the story of people's struggles. And so, with all my apprehension, I thought, well, I've got to tell this story somehow, and I hope I'll get some help from Eddie. Because he's a master storyteller, but he doesn't like to talk. But what he does do is he says at the end, you should have said this and you should have said that. So, one of the important things about our story is that we've had some good storytellers in our time. And one of them is a man called C.L.R. James. And C.L.R. James wrote a book called The Black Jackals. And it is the story of the Haitian Revolution. And the Black Jacobins was like a Bible to us in the Black Panther movement. We read it, we had classes about it, and we used to discuss it and talk about it in every shape and form, back and forth, all of the things that happened in Haiti. And one of the things that kept the people of Haiti going was that they had come into the New World with their own thoughts and their own belief systems. And they have their own concept of their gods and goddesses. And one of the important gods of the Haitian people, you hear about Haitian voodoo, but one of the important spirits of the Haitian people is the god Ogun. He's the warrior. And it is that warrior that kept the people of Haiti focused on the target. And as Eddie always says, he says, well, if they were Catholics and they went to confess, they wouldn't win. So, we saw a film on the BBC recently where they showed Caribbean people coming to England. And they even showed that we were put in a bunker in Brixton under the road, really, to live. And one of the things that that tells us is that we had no spaces. We didn't have places to gather. We didn't have housing. We weren't provided for when we came here. So we had to make our own way. So that as a result of that, we first started to talk about our history in Hyde Park. That was a focus for talking about our history. And many, many Pan-Africanists talk there. Walter Rodney, who's written How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, talked at the park. And I don't know if many of you are old enough to remember Roy Saw. He used to talk at the park in a very flippant way. And he used to say things like, you know, I never saw a fish with fingers, but in Britain they have fish fingers. You know, that kind of BS, you know. And it was clear that the energy in the park needed to go somewhere in terms of organizing around the needs of black people. And when we have to do something, we have to do it, no matter what it costs. And the first place that the Black Panther movement had a center was in Eddie's room. We used to have a guest tetner in there to roll off our paper. We used to meet in there. We used to cook in there. We used to, I mean, I can't understand how we could stand it, really. But that was how we had a crisis of space. I came to England as a student, and my first experience of racism was at that same University of London Union where Jeremy Corbyn's meeting was held to talk about the media. That was where the Lodgings Bureau of the University of London was located. And the Lodgings Bureau used to have two lists. One of people who would, landlords and landladies who would take black students, and one of landlords and landladies who wouldn't. And when we got to hear about it, the Socialist Society and other sympathetic people organized a protest and a sit-in at the University of London in protest against this, because the University of London said, if we only have one list, we'll have fewer houses. And we said, yes, let's have fewer houses. And they refused to budge, and we had a sit-in. And the Black Panther movement brothers, there weren't many sisters then, as I remember it, came to support us in the sit-in. And Eddie came as part of the group from the Black Panther movement that day in 1965 or 1966. And but for a few other little hiccups, we've been together ever since. And we moved from there, from the University of London, as a student myself, to go to the community and begin to see in what way we could organize and mobilize. But I had a few lessons to learn along the way. When my professor, I was doing a PhD at the time, and my professor heard that I was giving out leaflets against the presence of Enoch Powell, who is really that earlier incarnation of Nigel Farage. And he was saying that Caribbean people should be sent back home, and he talked about the Tiber flowing with rivers of blood and so on and so forth. And we were giving out leaflets against the Conservative Society, inviting him to talk at the college. And when my professor heard about it, he called me and said, well, first of all, the issue of racism in my mind at that time, as a student coming from Trinidad, this was something to do with ignorant people. And I had an eye-opener because my professor called me and said, you know, I heard you've been giving out leaflets and so on and so forth, but Powell has a point. And I said, well, what point does he have? And he said, well, you know, out there some people think that black people didn't work metal south of the Sahara. And I said, really? But we have the Benin bronzes, it's just across there in the British Museum because we go on Gower Street. And he said, well, some people think the Portuguese brought those there. And I realized that this was an issue of power, and it wasn't an issue of knowledge or information. Anyway, he ended this course by telling me, anyhow, You get a PhD if you want one, which meant you're on your own, gal. So this was my experience of racism in England. And we went around the community from door to door. We brought out leaflets, we printed our newspaper, Freedom News, and so on, and we were out there agitating and saying to black people, listen, we have some issues here, let's wake up. And in the course of doing that, large numbers of youths began to be attracted to the Black Panther movement. People who were running youth clubs in the community started to take an interest in what we were doing. And one such person was a person who ran Oval House, and he offered us a space there. And because of that opening up of that space in Oval House, it became clear to the authorities that we were making an impact on the young people who were really traumatized and brutalized in this country with impunity by the police. And so we came now under that kind of scrutiny as we expanded out of the one room into areas which were previously not available to us. So we used to put on plays at Oval House, we used to put on dances at Oval House, and so on. And one of the important activities of the movement was to study, to read and study. And the central book of our study was the Black Jacobins. And that is why the struggle in Haiti is very important to us today. Because we learned from the Black Jacobins what it was like to organize, to be self-organizing, to have confidence in our capacity to change our lives and therefore to change the world. That is what we learned from the Black Jacobins. We read it every week. We had study groups. We met every day. So when Selma asked me to talk about how we won, that victory was a victory that arose over a period of time, organizing, over a period of time meeting, over a period of time talking, over a period of time leafleting. We had a program in the community where we used to go door to door in Brixton. And we would knock on a door and say we came to talk to some black people about what is happening. And then somebody would say, oh no black people live here, but if you go next door, you will find them. And that was how we really made contact with the community. We had a door-to-door program. We met every day on one pretext or another. And every Sunday, we met to study. Among the texts that we studied was the Black Jacobins. And that became central to our understanding of what struggle was about. Let us move to the Mangrove. You can imagine that an organization which used to meet in somebody's room as the headquarters of all activities, we would develop to the stage where we had a restaurant owned by a black Trinidadian, Frank Critchlow. It was a hub. Everybody used to go there. The lame, the halt, and the blind could be found at the Mangrove. Everybody used to go there.
And the famous.
And so the Mangrove was important to us. Not just because it was owned by Frank and we could go there anytime and eat a plate of food. It was important for us as a symbol of our movement from one room to a whole building. I mean, imagine that, you know? So when the police took it upon themselves to describe the Mangrove as a haunt for ponces and prostitutes and drug addicts. It was a form of abuse that most of us didn't recognize. I didn't recognize myself in that picture, and I am sure most of the Caribbean people and English people who went to the Mangrove restaurant didn't recognize themselves in that description. But as you know, and is well known and has been established, that when people see you as a victim, they think that they know you and that they can do anything they like. And that was not the way we saw ourselves at all. And it came as such a surprise to the police that Frank refused to pay them money. It came as such a surprise to the police that no matter how often they would come there when people were eating and disrupt the restaurant and damage his business, that he refused to budge. And we felt that that kind of harassment could not be tolerated. It was not acceptable, and we would not have it. And so we had organized many demonstrations. We organized a demonstration in support of the struggle in Trinidad in 1970. We organized a demonstration when the British sent troops to Anguilla. Anguilla is a little island in the Caribbean. And I don't know if you remember Harold Wilson when Ian Smith declared UDI. Harold Wilson said he was not going to send troops to what was then Rhodesia to kill his kith and kin. This is a Labour Prime Minister. Let me interject at this stage that we've come a long way since, because we have Jeremy Corbyn. So we organized a demonstration in the community against the harassment of the Mangrove restaurant. And as I said, we had had many demonstrations in central London. There were a lot of arrests whenever we went to Hyde Park and so on. Said we would go in the community and march to all the police stations in the community. Notting Hill, Nottingdale, Ladbroke Grove. And that's what we did. We marched around to each police station. And I don't know if the police were getting tired or they had orders or both. But at a certain stage they decided they were going to break up the demonstration. And they had certain people who they targeted for arrest. And there were many arrests, and out of that, 9 people were charged with riot and affray to be brought to the Old Bailey for trial. The charge of riot was dropped in the magistrate's court, but when we reached the Old Bailey, the charge of riot was reintroduced. And it was clear that the state had come out to make an example of us. One of the things that we had learned in our experience was that when we had a dance at Oval House, the dance was full of people. The police came to the door and said they wanted to get in because a young man had stolen a watch and run into the dance. Now this is a hall about twice the size of this, with 10 times as many people in it, in a party. Police wants to come in there to look for a watch. So we said, well, that's not practical. You gotta wait until the dance is over, and if you can identify somebody coming out, then that's it. But they wouldn't hear it. And they turned the lights on at the time when the dance was grooving, and you know what grooving is at that time of the night. And everybody was startled. And as a result of which, missiles reached the police, and they arrested people. Among the people they arrested was a young man who was coming from work who wasn't even in the dance. So when we went to court the next day to post bail for the people who were arrested, one of the special branch officers said, look, one of them there. That's the idea pointing at him. He wasn't arrested on the night, but he was arrested in court the next day because they knew who they wanted to arrest. And 4 of them were charged with riot and were taken before the Old Bailey. That was about a year at least before the Mangrove case. Yeah. And in that trial, we had a very learned, elderly, eminent Queen's Counsel whose name I will not quote. But in his summing up, when he was talking to the judge about the arrests of these young black men, he said to the judge, we should have some understanding of what this is about, because in our country we have people like Hell's Angels. And I thought to myself, what? You know, you have a situation where black people are standing up for their right to be human in Britain, and you compare us to Hell's Angels as a Queen's Counsel putting your case to the judge, our case to the judge. It was clear then that there was a huge divide between what we knew of ourselves and what lawyers of the ilk of the person who was representing those defendants in the Oval House for, what they were going to say to judges about us. And it was in this context that when the Mangrove 9 came to court and we sat in the courtroom and we surveyed the scene, I was convinced. I had a lawyer who was from Trinidad, a very good lawyer. But when I heard him talking about my honor, my honor, my honor, I thought, shit. This is not it. This is not how it's going to be. I don't know if you've ever been in a court, high court in England. All the men are dressed in women's clothes, long black dresses. And they have women's wigs on their head, white, curly wigs. And the judge has the same clothes. So when you're in there, you realize that it's himself to himself. It's nothing to do with you. You know? And they talk to each other about you. And you're sitting there, and you don't recognize yourself. So it was in that context that two of us decided that we would defend ourselves. This would give us an opportunity to talk to the jury in a language which we think the jury might more easily understand than the language that the judges and the lawyers spoke. And it also gives us an opportunity to tell the truth about what we were experiencing in this country.
We've complained to the police about the police and nothing's been done. We've complained to magistrates about magistrates and nothing's been done. We've complained to judges about judges and nothing's been done. Now it's time to do something ourselves. That statement was made at the Mangrove demonstration and represents the essence of black people's experience in Britain. That since we've come here, we've suffered a long train of abuses by the police with the active knowledge and support of the British state.
And that was the basis on which 7 defendants had legal representation and 2 of us defended ourselves. Selma wants to know how we won. We won because we prepared. Before the case came to trial, we used to meet all the time. And we used to meet with a renegade lawyer who's sitting on my right here. And he agreed to put our case for a jury of our peers. We had got that language from the United States. They were able to select jurors, and we thought that it was important for us to make a thrust in the direction of having black jurors hear this story. And it wasn't only important for black jurors to hear the story. It was important for white jurors to hear the story in the presence of black jurors. Because that is the only way, when a jury is sitting in a room debating about an issue, if they're all white, they can say whatever they like. If there are black people there, they have to talk in a completely different way. So even though we might have jurors, white jurors, who were sympathetic to us, it was important for us to get as many black jurors on the panel as possible. And because we had this very good person who was prepared to wage the struggle for that, we were able to put the case for having a panel of jurors whom we could challenge and select so that we could get some jurors on, black jurors on the case. And during the course of the trial, we were aware that it was important to not be isolated down in the Old Bailey, but to keep the community apprised of what was happening. So the Black Panther movement was at the core of the activities to keep the momentum going for an awareness of what was happening. So we did a number of things which were important at the time to keep the community informed. One was we pulled everybody out who could spare the time from work to come and have a demonstration outside of the court on a daily basis. And for those people who weren't able to come on the demonstration, I think it was Eddie who suggested that we should put out a daily bulletin about what was happening in the case. So every day there were people outside the courts demonstrating, and every day the police would come and start to harass the demonstration, move on, move on, move on. And invariably, somebody would get arrested. And after that had happened about 3 or 4 times, as I said, we used to meet every day, we'd go back and say, what is the situation? We cannot continue to have all these arrests. So a person who shall be nameless said, why don't we have a women's demonstration? And there was a lot of misgivings about having a women's demonstration, but eventually it made sense and we prevailed. And when the women's demonstration came outside of the Old Bailey, the police started moving in numbers. And then they pulled back and said, oh my God, there's a bunch of fucking women. And so the demonstration after that became a feature of the trial which the police was unable to continually harass. And the other aspect of it was that because the issue of racism was on the agenda and we were able to bring the issue of racism into our defense, the judge kept saying, but this is not a political trial. Mrs. LeQuant, I'm giving you every latitude, he said, because he felt that I was stepping over what was judicially acceptable in the court. So those were some of the strategies that helped us to open the eyes of the public, of the jury, of the lawyers in the struggle to bring the real meaning of this case to to the attention of the authorities. And we were not without challenges in the course of this process. Whenever we have a struggle, there are going to be people whose personal interest will be challenged by the group interest. And there's always going to be a time when you're going to get an offer which apparently you can't refuse. My offer was, you're a nice girl from Trinidad who is a student, and you were led astray by these Black Power people. So if you choose to offer that as your defense, we will be able to save you from ultimate disaster. Well, you know what the answer to that was. Frank's lawyer, I remember we were downstairs in the Old Bailey and we were all meeting there. I think Frank's lawyer had called for a meeting. And Frank was sitting with his head down. And it was clear that he was under some kind of pressure. And the pressure that he was under was that his lawyer was proposing that he was an innocent restaurateur businessman who was led astray by these Black Power people. I think that was one time in the trial where I lost it. I used some four-letter words. I have my shoe off.
You took your shoe off. Council. Down in the cells.
And I really said, you know, after 400 years, we're still at this stage where one SN white so-and-so could come and say, you know, you are nice and you are not nice, so therefore we'll take the nice one and put this one and take the bad one. It was a terrible moment, and I hope that I won't do that again. I hope I won't do that again.
The problem with him was he was about 6'4". He had to stretch up to hit him.
Let's not put this on the public record. So it was tense. It was really tense because at every stage in the trial, you were challenged to justify saying the things you were saying in court about British justice. And I remember when Selma came, she came in as a witness, looking posh. And I was asking her some questions. And I said to her, you are Mrs. Selma James and C.L.R. James, is one who wrote the Black Jackals? And she said yes. And the judge said, Jacobeans? And we said, no, the Black Jacobins, you know, the people who made the revolution in Haiti. And he said, Mrs. DeQuenta, I'm giving you every latitude, but I think you should know that these things wouldn't help your case. And I said, I thought you said I was going to be tried on the evidence. So we had serious challenges in dealing with all of the challenges that any movement faces. We are facing the challenge from outside, and we are facing the challenge from within ourselves, our uncertainties, our fears, our worries that we won't win, or that we will be defeated, or that we will go to prison for a long time, or that we wouldn't get our PhD, or that we wouldn't rise in the world, or whatever. These are very real fears, very real concerns, because if you get convicted, then you're not able to get work, and this and that and the other. So when we say that we challenged the state, we also had to challenge ourselves. We had to challenge ourselves in what we believed, what we stood for, why we were there, and so on and so forth. And the challenges are relentless. They don't stop. So that it is in reading the Black Jacobins and in looking at the way African people in bondage in Haiti were able to organize themselves and struggle relentlessly with many losses, with loss of life, with loss of limb, with loss of food, with loss of children, with many, many, many losses. It was the struggle of those African people in Haiti that sustained us in our understanding of what we need to be doing here in order to challenge a ruling elite which is like no other in this world. I think we have to understand the nature of Britain to understand what we take on when we stand to make a challenge here. In the Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James is absolutely clear about abolition. He says, William Pitt asked Wilberforce to bring the legislation on abolition to the House. And he said, if you don't do it, I have some people here lined up to do it. The abolition of slavery had nothing to do with the goodwill of Wilberforce. The abolition of slavery was tied directly into the wealth that was being generated in Haiti. And that wealth was going to the French. The British had now gone to India and was opening up free trade in India. Haiti was a very prosperous country, bringing in millions and millions of pounds per year. Liverpool was made in Haiti. Bristol was made in Haiti. The London docks were made in Haiti. The wealth of Haiti made Britain. And of all the ex-colonial countries, Britain continues today to be the ruler of the roost. The British were instrumental and central to apartheid in South Africa. The wealth of Oxford is the wealth of Zimbabwe, formerly called Rhodesia, when Cecil Rhodes took his caravans on behalf of the British elite and the British royalty to take land and resources in southern Africa. And the wealth of this country is still the wealth of Africa and African enslaved people. Therefore, the presence of African people in England and the presence of people who are willing to struggle against imperialism has to recognize the role of Haiti in creating the conditions for us to be able to say we can win at all costs. The cost is high, but the cost of failure is even higher. When the Haitian Revolution took place, the British was still angling to invade Haiti. And Toussaint said to them, if you do not stop with your maneuvering, we will take Jamaica. And this is when the British pulled back from directly trying to overthrow the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution, therefore, is central to our concerns here in Britain because of all the ex-colonial countries. Britain remains the most important, the most wealthy, the most organized, the most cunning of the countries that have been able to hold on to the wealth, and they are now calling it the Commonwealth. So, why we have to put Haiti on the agenda in England is not only because the Haitian Revolution has shown us what is possible at all odds. It's important to us because we need to learn from them what it is like to continue to struggle against all odds. And this is what we learned in the struggle in England here. This is why the Mangrove restaurant and the struggle to fight against police abuse supported by the state was such an important event in the history of struggle in England. And this is why it is so important that you have come out here tonight, and this is why it is so important for us to recognize that we have a moment here in England where we have a leadership in the Labour Party which is facing a different direction. And it is not going to be easy for the leadership of the Labour Party to do this on their own. The leadership of the Labour Party needs the movement from the streets. The leadership of the Labour Party needs the support of people in the communities. The leadership of the Labour Party needs the support of the students. The leadership of the Labour Party needs the support of the workers. The leadership of the Labour Party needs the support primarily of the women's movement. The wageless are the people who are at the foundation of the wealth of all societies. And the biggest group of wageless people are women. The leadership of the Labour Party needs to hear the voice of the wageless woman. And we need to continue to connect our struggles with the struggles of the people of Haiti, with the struggles of the people in Southern Africa, with the struggles of people in Uganda, Gambia, Zimbabwe, wherever imperialism has put its clutches and have refused to move, and now have a layer of the black elite who are doing the work for them. We need to continue to expose them, and we need to continue to join in that struggle across the Atlantic and across the Pacific to make a change in this world, such as the people of Haiti have shown us is possible. Thank you.
us how we can win. I think so. Some principles are there and we can follow in our organizing. It was an amazing thing to testify at the Mangrove trial. It was like going home. I was worried about going into a courtroom, but the courtroom was ours. The people in the gallery were our people. I was going to be with the people in the courtroom, not with the state. And I think it was useful also with the testimony that I was able to give as a result. Now, our second speaker is Mcdonald, who has been introduced by what Althea said about him. So it is my pleasure to introduce Mcdonald.
Well, thank you. I want to say one or two things about the so-called left-wing lawyers in the time when that trial took place in 1971. And it was one of the best-known left-wing lawyers that Althea referred to in the Oval trial. And one of the problems was that they had no idea that when you go into a court, if you're representing someone off the street, you don't have the same power as if you go into court representing a movement. And they didn't understand that when you are representing a movement, you can say things as a lawyer in that court that you go beyond what you might say if you're representing some individual. That's right. And that was something that was always there during the Mangrove trial. On one occasion, Althea referred to the fact that the public gallery was always full. It was. And we also had a judge who was a notorious bully. And on one occasion, he decided to send Darkus down into the cells for not sitting down and shut up when he was talking. And I got up to protest. And the thing went something like this. He said, "Well, Miss Mcdonald, are you going to apologise to me after what you've said?" And I said, "Certainly, my lord, if you first apologise to me." And that got applause from the public gallery. And he then said, "All right, Miss Mcdonald, you've got your applause from the public gallery. Will you now sit down?" And one of the jurors, who was an art teacher or something, drew a cartoon which he gave to me at the end of the trial, in which he repeats this thing, but he's got the judge sitting up there, and he's got me doing this to the judge. And then underneath he's put the caption, "Mr. Mcdonald, will you please apologise to me?" And me saying, "Certainly, my lord, if you first apologise to me." So that was one of the things. The same artist in the jury. Also, after I'd done my closing speech, he presented me with the second cartoon. And one of the things that the police had said was, the question was why they took out their truncheons. And they said they took out their truncheons because people were throwing stones at them. So I went into the Old Bailey and took a tennis racket with me, and I couldn't get a truncheon, so I took a poker. And I went in and I said to the jury, members of the jury, the police say they took out their truncheons because they were being stoned. I said, if that's all they did, if you're trying to stop stones and I've waved my poker, you're not going to do very well. The police would have been much better if they'd gone armed there, not with truncheons, but with tennis rackets. And I took my tennis racket out and I said, well, look, you can catch stones on tennis rackets and stop them hitting you. So that was also, the cartoon of that was also done by this artist, which he gave to me. I've got photocopies of them at least, yes. God knows where the originals went, but anyhow. So one of the things that in that trial, I was aware of how powerful I could be as an advocate because of all the support. You came to court in the morning and there were people on that little centre aisles that used to be outside the Old Bailey. I don't think it's there anymore. And they were the people who were demonstrating. You then go into the court and the gallery. If you imagine, there's a gallery up there. If you imagine that's full of supporters that have been brought in, you can imagine that in that court you have an enormous power as an advocate. Now, during the course of the trial, I was asked, first of all, the defendants wanted to have an all-black jury. And with a bit of luck, one of the persons in my chambers he was the head of department when I lectured in Kingston, and he had studied medieval English for his degree. Can you imagine it? Medieval English. That's Chaucer and backwards. He told me, he said, I know that in the basement of the Middle Temple, they've got pleas of the crown. And in those, you will find about what they did for juries. So I go to these are all predated Magna Carta. And these things were all written in medieval Latin shorthand, which I couldn't read. But again, fortunately, there was a bloke in these chambers who had studied for the priesthood in Rome. If you studied in the priesthood in Rome, you learnt medieval Latin shorthand. So I gave him all these things and he was delighted because he hadn't used this skill for about 30 years. He translated them for us. And they were documents which gave, if an Italian merchant had a dispute, they had what was known as the jury of the half-tongue. And you would have half the jury would be Italian merchants and the other half would be members of the local community. And then there was, in Wales, I don't know if North Wales, they built all these castles. And most castles on the seafront are pointing out to sea so that people can't get into the sea. In Wales, they're all pointing backwards into the middle of Wales because they were built to keep out the Welsh marchers. And if you had a jury where one of these was on trial, they would have a jury of other Welsh marchers. So that was a good foundation. And about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the judge said, Mr. Mcdonald, it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we haven't even got to Magna Carta yet. So I thought, well, bugger you. So I then handed him up copies of the untranslated Latin text. And I said, my lord, I can't find the translation at the moment, but I'm sure your lordship can read this. And he sort of slammed his fist on the desk. And so, I said, oh, maybe I found it now. And handed them up the translation. Anyhow, we eventually got to Magna Carta. And Magna Carta, you have the jury of your peers. something everyone knows about, it's well known. But it was predated by all these other things that I'd never heard of before, except for this, thanks to two guys who had done very odd things. One had studied medieval English for his degree, and the other one had been tried but failed to become a priest in Rome and had understood shorthand Latin. So we eventually, the second day, we got on to Magna Carta, and then we got on to the first time when women were allowed to become jurors and got the vote in 1918, just after the First World War. It had a provision that you could have an all-women jury or an all-male jury, so I fastened on to that. And anyhow, eventually, I got up to modern times, when I'd finished, the judge looked at me and said, "Application dismissed." So I said, "Well, aren't you going to give any reasons?" And he said, "No, application dismissed." So one of the other things that we all did, and Althea will remember this, in those days, if you paid a shilling, you got the whole names and addresses and occupations of the people who would come to do jury service the following day, or whatever it was. And we pored over these, and we picked out, people that we would object to and all the rest of it. At that time, you had 7 objections. Each person had 7 objections. No reasons needed to be given. And with 9 people, it meant there were 63 objections, which, there were only about 63 jurors coming on. And one of the things that we got stymied by was that every time a black juror got called up, the prosecution asked them to stand by. And they could do that without any reason at all. However, we did manage to get onto that jury a number, I think it was about 3 or 4 black jurors. So we started off, that was 2 days. And we kind of were trying to set the situation in which this trial was going to take place. And I kind of felt that my role, or one of my roles, apart from telling the judge to apologise to me, but one of my roles was to make sure that those who were unrepresented were not separated from those who were represented. And that was quite an important role. I realised it because there was a young barrister who's now a Crown Court judge who was sitting next to me, and the whole time when I was, getting on my feet and making objections, he kept pulling my gown and saying, "Ian, you're not doing your client any good." And I used to tell him, "Shut up." But he was pulling, it was ridiculous. Now that was going on the whole time, and I think Althea's made a big confession about what happened down in the cells, and I won't go into that. But it was one of the most marvellous things I have ever seen. Because we had, in those days, they had these enormous cells, which were whole rooms, down in the cell part of the Old Bailey. And we had one of those rooms where everyone met, over lunch and after the end of the day. And this big 6'4", Croft was his name, he later became a Crown Court judge, and that sort of voice. Those attempts to split up the defendants continued throughout the trial. At the end of the trial, there were speeches, and the speeches of Darcus and Althea were fantastic. I had to make a speech on behalf of Barbara Beese, who I was representing, and I thought it was important because I'd been reading up and looking at and getting great inspiration from the trials that were taking place in the United States and the trial lawyers there. And one of the things they did was that they dealt with the psychology of the court, of the structure of the court and its effect. And so I introduced that into my speech, about what the court, the Old Bailey is just, it's a wonderful architectural relic of this kind of power operation. You have the judge who sits halfway up to heaven. Then you have below him, you have a row of people, the jury, and then down in the bottom you have counsel, and then you have this great big square wooden pen, the dock. And at the beginning, you know, the people come up through the staircase into the dock, and we are supposed to start that you are innocent until you are proved guilty. But when someone comes up into that thing, people looking on are going to say, well, they wouldn't be doing that unless they've done something. And so in a sense, the architecture reverses the whole concept that you're innocent until you're proved guilty. They've stopped building courts like that, but if you go to the Old Bailey, that's how the main courts still are. So that was an important thing, I thought, at that time. I wouldn't do that now because juries we live in a different climate. But at that time, that was quite an important thing, which we had discussed beforehand. And then I dealt with the judge. And I said, members of the jury, this is not the court of the Star Chamber. This is not Russia. But we have had examples of judicial tyranny in this court, which are more suitable to those places than to the Old Bailey. Hush over the court. It needed to be said. Afterwards, I was called up and told that the powers that be were thinking of taking disciplinary action against me. And I was to be charged with two things. One was my tyranny speech, which was tape recorded. Closing speeches are not normally tape recorded. Mine was. So was Darkis's, and I think so was Althea's. And that was an experiment that the Lord Chancellor's Department were trying out. But afterwards, we had a celebration dinner in the Mangrove restaurant, which I attended, and so did about 4 jurors. What's the actress's name? Yeah. And the other guest of honour was Vanessa Redgrave. And the local newspaper said who the guests were, and they mentioned my name and Vanessa Redgrave's name. And so that was then, the judge lived in Notting Hill, and he sent that off to the powers that be. So that was charge number 2, that I'd I don't know what the charge was actually, whether I'd gone to the Mangrove, or whether I was sitting with Vanessa Redgrave, or whether it was because there were 4 jurors there. We never got that far. So after all this, I had begun to be part of a rent strike in London, in which 100,000 tenants were withholding rent increases that had been imposed on them. It was a very big movement. And a lot of the people who were part of that movement worked at Covent Garden Market, which was then a proper, vegetable and market. And so Althea's lot, the Black Panther movement, were going to come down if these proceedings were taken against me and demonstrate. But I also was able to, when I told the shop steward, who was also one of the tenants who was withholding the rent increase, that I was likely to be, charged with bad conduct or something. And he said, oh, well, we finish about 10 o'clock in the morning, and we'll bring some of the lads down, and we can join in. So I was going to have the shop stewards committee from Covent Garden, I was going to have the Black Panthers, and I don't know whether somehow the powers that be heard about it, but I ended up getting a letter, could I go and see the sub-treasurer of the Middle Temple? So I went in there, and there was this very kindly old gentleman called Lord Salmon, who was a House of Lords judge. And he said, sit down, Mcdonald. I'd come prepared. He said, sit down, Mcdonald. So I sat down. And he said, first thing I want to say to you is that it's very important that members of the bar stand up to the judiciary. And I thought, what on earth am I hearing? And he said, in a very much quieter voice, he said, but I wouldn't have done it the way you did. And that was it. And we then had a discussion. He'd been the judge that had sentenced some of the white racist thugs at Notting Hill to 4 years and hard labour, I think it was. He said, oh, I thought I'd cleared all that up. So I said, well, we can accept the contribution you've made, but there's a long way to go. And that was my meeting. I never met him again. But I was totally surprised, but it shows what happens when you have that kind of movement that you have, in a sense, spearheaded, but also that you can rely on and gives you an awful lot of standing and power that you wouldn't possibly get in what wouldn't be your everyday practice at the bar. And that was the important thing that was different, because I think a number of things were introduced into the UK from the United States, not just the Black Panther movement, but also the way in which lawyers who were attached to both the civil rights and to the Panthers had in fact begun to use courthouse strategies, which actually broke this terrible, tedious, yes, my lord, no, my lord, can I please do what you want me to do, my lord, kind of advocacy. I think that was also a contribution, because it meant that those other lawyers would have to come through me before they could start trying to destroy what Althea and Darcus were doing as people who represented themselves. And that, to me, was probably the most important trial that I've taken part in.
Thank you.